The country earned about $3.6 billion from exports in the just concluded fiscal year, a record high in the country's history. According to authorities, Ethiopia's external earnings rose 20%, with agricultural products such as coffee and flowers driving that growth.
At the heart of Africa's ancient coffee, Ethiopia is brewing a new future. Thanks to China's zero-tariff treatment, exporters are now accessing the world's second-largest economy without the barriers that once held them back.
It's really good news because it will make our coffee very competitive in China market.
This trade deal was never announced on CNN. No breaking news banner, no emergency meeting in Washington. But American companies noticed it the moment their calls stopped being returned. Contracts that were almost signed suddenly vanished. Shipments were delayed, and competitors they'd never seen before stepped in. This wasn't a sanction. This wasn't a trade war. This was Ethiopia quietly choosing a different path, one that didn't include the United States. And here's what makes this dangerous for Washington. Ethiopia didn't ask for permission. It didn't negotiate through American institutions. It simply moved on. What looks like one trade deal is actually a warning sign Africa is learning how to grow without U.S. involvement, and once that door closes, it doesn't reopen easily. So how did Ethiopia pull this off, and why are U.S. companies now scrambling to catch up? This trade shift did not begin with a speech, a press release, or a diplomatic crisis. It began in silence. No headlines warned Washington. No emergency meeting was called. But inside international supply chains, something changed, and American companies felt it almost immediately. Emails stopped getting replies. Contracts that were nearly finalized stalled without explanation. Tariff exemptions that once moved smoothly through customs began to slow down, then quietly disappear. At first, it was dismissed as routine bureaucracy, then as political instability, then as a temporary disruption. But it wasn't temporary. Ethiopia wasn't hesitating. It was moving deliberately, strategically, and without asking for approval. What unfolded was not a trade war. There were no threats, no sanctions, no retaliation. Instead, Ethiopia did something far more consequential. It rewrote the rules under which trade with the United States had operated for years. To understand why this matters, you have to understand Ethiopia's position in the global economy and why Washington underestimated it. Ethiopia is not a marginal player. It is one of Africa's most populous countries, a manufacturing hub in the Horn of Africa, and a critical gateway linking African markets to the Middle East and Asia. For years, global corporations viewed Ethiopia as a long-term prize. Low-cost manufacturing, agricultural processing, logistics, aviation, and infrastructure. American companies were deeply embedded in that vision. But access came with conditions. Trade privileges were tied to compliance frameworks. Tariff advantages depended on political alignment. Market access could be adjusted or withdrawn based on decisions made far from Addis Ababa. From Washington's perspective, this system provided stability and influence. From Ethiopia's perspective, it created vulnerability. Tariffs were not just economic tools, they were leverage. And over time, Ethiopian policymakers began to see that leverage as a strategic risk. Trade, after all, is not just about goods crossing borders. It is about who controls the pathways, who sets the standards, and who holds the power to interrupt the flow. Ethiopia did not announce a break with the United States. It did something more sophisticated. It diversified. Behind closed doors, trade frameworks were reviewed. Import tariffs were reassessed. Export incentives were redesigned. Long-term supply agreements were renegotiated with an emphasis on flexibility rather than loyalty. The goal was not confrontation. It was insulation. Reduce dependency on any single partner. Lower exposure to politically conditional access. Create multiple trade corridors instead of one dominant route. From the outside, these changes looked procedural, technical adjustments buried in policy documents. Inside global markets, they were seismic. American firms began to notice that they were no longer prioritized, not excluded, just no longer favored. In global trade, that distinction is critical. There were no bans on U.S. companies, no explicit discrimination, but bids that American firms expected to win went elsewhere. Shipping contracts shifted to competitors. Manufacturing commitments were reassigned. Tariffs that once gave U.S. companies a competitive edge were now neutral or, in some cases, slightly disadvantageous. And when margins are thin, even small tariff changes determine who survives and who exits. Billions of dollars in projected revenue did not vanish overnight. They faded quietly from forecasts, one deal at a time. This is why Washington did not react immediately. There was no single moment to point to, no dramatic trigger, just a growing realization that influence had eroded not through resistance but through irrelevance. Ethiopia's strategy worked because it avoided the mistakes that trigger retaliation. It did not accuse. It did not threaten. It did not posture. It simply created a system where American leverage mattered less, and that is what caught Washington off guard. For decades, U.S. trade policy assumed that access to American markets, institutions, and capital would always be enough to maintain influence, that tariff privileges and regulatory alignment would keep partners anchored, but global trade has changed. Countries are no longer choosing sides, they are choosing options. Ethiopia chose optionality. From a geopolitical standpoint, this was modern economic statecraft, not ideology, not rebellion. Control over tariffs meant control over growth. Diversified trade